Well, on today's program, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Melissa Marot, who works as an organizational psychologist in Melbourne, Australia. Hello, Melissa. How are you?
Hi, good, thank you. Really great to see you today.
Great to see you too. I know we're like in such different time zones. You're starting your day. I'm ending mine. You're starting
Uh,
winter, right?
yeah, we are starting winter, and it's a very chilly. Well, for us, 11 degrees I think today, and but it's a little bit different here than different parts of the world. We feel cold when it's 11.
Yeah. Well, we're about to have summer and our air conditioner's working. So, but thank you for giving up some of your morning to
You're
talk
most
to us. Um, you work as an organizational psychologist.
ask. Do you know what an organizational psychologist is?
I don't know. Tell me.
Yeah, so often when I say organizational psychologist, people kind of look at me and say, "What on earth does that mean?" And then they ask questions like, is it a Marie Kondo type of thing where you go in and organize things? Being an organizational psychologist, and well, it's not. So in terms of organizational psychology, we're often called different things in different parts of the world. We have multiple personalities from that perspective. In the US, we tend to be called industrial and organizational psychologists. So that kind of gives you a bit of an indication in terms of what we do. So in terms of what I do, I work with organizations around things like leadership, structure, values, culture, how we respond to situations as an organization, but also as individuals. So in terms of what I've more recently tended to focus on is people that work in complex environments. Complex and fast-moving environments, like emergency response, like disaster and crisis management. How do we respond to that as individuals and as an organization? How do we respond to that in terms of the stress and the resilience that we need to be able to work through those scenarios? So that gives you a bit of a clue in terms of what I do.
It does. And you're a psychologist, so I'm glad I'm asking the questions today and not you. So you mentioned disaster restoration or disaster
Yeah.
issues, and I know today our topic is how the restoration industry can respond to the emotional side of disasters. And I know you've
Yeah.
worked with the RIA, the Restoration Industry Association. You've been, I believe, doing some presentations with them in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've presented at conferences around these kinds of topics, and have also worked with organizations around these kind of topics in terms of how they can respond to disaster as an organization and then look after their people who are responding to those disasters as well.
Great, great. So I basically have four questions for you today. And the first one is this: what goes through the minds of those who are the victims of disaster, like fire, flood, hurricane, devastating thing? Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's quite a lot. And in terms of, I mean, I could spend days and days in terms of talking about what goes through their mind. In fact, we spend a career on this. But to be able to put it into just a few sentences, the main thing that tends to happen for people when they respond to those kinds of things is feeling overloaded and overwhelmed. So totally overloaded in terms of that emotional response and overwhelmed in terms of what's happening for them. So if we think about it, it's a complex emotional situation. You've got multiple parties that are involved. You've got police, emergency services, you've got insurers coming in, you've got assessors coming in, you've got restorers coming in, you've got all of this stuff happening that's happening to you. And that's the difficult thing, is that you tend to lose your sense of agency and control in the situation.
Mm-hmm. And those watching this program today are mainly those doing the work, going into homes or
Yeah.
businesses of those that have been through these things. So,
Yeah.
with that in mind, my second question is: can you provide some guidance on what these individuals, these professional restoration people, should look for and recognize in those that they're trying to help, and how they can better help them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you kind of look out for, and I'll go through a couple of points here that you can look out for these kinds of areas. Firstly, it's thinking about the people that you're working with in terms of the people in the home, that they're in that complex emotional state, they're in that shock response. And there is no right or wrong in terms of that shock response, but most people tend to not be themselves. And they're different to how they normally and typically would be. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and be empathetic towards that in terms of how you might respond to a situation like that. And we sometimes can forget that when we're working in those environments. I think the most important thing is when you're in that scenario is that you're not the professional psychologist, you are the restorer. So looking out for those things that can help you to be empathetic towards them. So a couple of things that happen for people. They tend to replay the memory, replay the event in infinite detail. So you might find as a restorer, someone will sit down with you and tell you for the 15th time exactly what happened and all the details that they want to make sure that you've captured. So keep that in mind, that that's a typical response for some people in those scenarios. Something else that they might respond with is fear and anxiety. They have an emotional reaction, things like anger, fear, anxiety, anger, sadness, all of these complex emotions, and they may direct it towards you because you're part of that scenario. So keeping that in mind can be helpful. People might want to avoid things, so avoidance can set in because they're overloaded and overwhelmed. So they might not respond to your emails. They may not respond to your phone calls because you're part of that event, that situation. People will be hyperactive in terms of their nervous system. So their nervous system will be amped up. So they might be on high alert. They might be jumpy. They might look out for things that might go wrong. And therefore they'll be asking you, what about this? What about that? What about that? Have you got this in mind? Yeah. So a few things might be happening in terms of how they're responding to you. Also, really importantly, is that it tends to change the way people see the world. So they start to believe that the world is dangerous. They feel that there are threats just around the corner. It becomes hard to trust people and situations when they experience that kind of disaster event. Keeping that in mind is helpful in terms of how you then interact with people. So the important thing to do there is build trust, and we can talk about that a little bit more.
This is great information and a big help. Here's an issue, Melissa. You know, a restoration tech is usually a man, and they get the technical training and they know what they're doing. And so they might think to themselves, I know how to do my job. I can fix this house. I can get it dry, you know, and they're not thinking about the emotional aspect of the one going through the loss. What would you say to that technician?
Well, I suppose first and foremost is that they're there to do a job, you know, to get the house dry, you know, to sort things out. And that's really important. However, to do that job well, we need to understand the client. We need to understand the customer in terms of what they're going through. Again, not to be a professional psychologist. That's my job. You don't need to do that. However, keeping in mind as to what's happening for the client can actually help you do your job better. You can manage that situation better because you still need to interact with the client and manage the job and get things done in terms of timing. So understanding the client is important. Being aware of your own reactions can be important because that's going to be there. And that's what we noticed, you know, here in Australia with the Townsville floods. You guys may have heard of that. You know, a few years ago up in northern Queensland, we had, you know, quite a large flooding event. We had a very recent flooding event as well. But what we found is that responders and restorers were having emotional reactions to the event. So knowing what's happening for you is super important. Building trust and understanding with the customer is super important. So they feel comfortable, and then you're actively managing all of those responses that I listed out before, not as a psychologist, but as a professional in the situation in terms of your job.
So really what people should do when they go to a home that's been damaged and they're going to deal with somebody, they should hire you to go along and help them with that job.
Well, potentially so, but maybe not necessary. You can refer them. You can refer them to a psychologist. I'm a little bit biased. I think psychologists do a pretty good job.
Yes. Any final thoughts on how the restoration industry can respond to the emotional side of disasters? Anything that we might have not covered?
Well, really practical things, you know, how can you build trust with the customer? How could you build trust with a client? I think that's the important thing, given that they've just had that shock response and they're overloaded and overwhelmed. So how can you build trust as a restorer? So a couple of things that can be really useful in terms of practical things that people can do. Just listen, you know, be compassionate, listen to what the person has got to say. You don't have to take it anyway. You don't have to kind of manage that, but just listen and be compassionate. Really importantly, communicate throughout the whole process in terms of what your job is and what you're doing, and communicate really simply and with clarity, and communicate often, especially at the start of the job when they're feeling overloaded and overwhelmed. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Dr. Melissa Marot, thank you so much for your advice. This is good information, and everyone who deals with people in disaster situations needs to watch this episode.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Really great to be here. Glad I could help.